people hop in after a bit. So thanks again for joining, Chrissy. I guess like just starting with the purpose of the meeting, I always like to do this, but like Landa Talks is a space in which we bring in external and internal experts a bit further along their consulting journey, just to share a bit about their experience and learnings, right? So I'm excited to host Chrissy in Landa Talks 5 already. I was lucky enough to work with at Uber indirectly. Thanks again for the time, Chrissy. I know you must be busy. And in terms of structure for this meeting, friendly, I guess like 30-minute chat with Chrissy, just questions and answer. We'll try to leave 10 minutes for questions from the public in the end. Feel free to add your questions throughout the meeting as well. That's completely fine. And then we'll leave some minutes for you to just unmute and ask Chrissy directly. Okay? Amazing. So hi
Awesome.
again, Chrissy. I guess like just
Thanks,
first
Chico.
question as always is giving a brief introduction about yourself. Who's Chrissy? Just for the rest of the call to get to know you.
Awesome. Great. Well, first, before I jump in, thanks for making the space. I had a number of folks that helped me along my journey when I was first starting out, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to pay it forward. One of those people was actually Max, your first Landa Talks. So I'm excited to be a part of the journey with everyone else. So yeah, I will give you a bit of background on myself. My name's Chrissy Donnelly. Most people call me Chrissy. And I'll tell you a bit about how I got here, and then we can kind of jump into the Q&A. So I'm originally from the United States. I started my career in New York in investment banking, and then was in a private equity fund for a couple of years, basically making investment decisions. Also spent some time doing fundraising for that fund. Then did a brief stint at an NGO in Colombia. Not super relevant career-wise, but I accidentally met my husband at a bar while living in Bogota, which changed the course of my career indirectly. We did long distance for 2 years. I went back to the States for my MBA at Stanford. There are no direct flights between Bogota and San Francisco, so we both ended up here in Mexico when I graduated in 2017. So I turned down a private equity offer in San Francisco, showed up in Mexico with no job and no plan. And fortunately, had a friend who was then working at Uber who said, this is the best job I've ever had. You need to interview here. I did, had an amazing experience. I was in mostly strategy roles, led the corporate strategy team for the rides business, which was about a $2 billion business for Latin America. Briefly, well, I guess for a year, led the overall strategy team. And then after about 3.5 years at Uber, I was looking for a change. I wasn't sure if that was a change within Uber or a change out of Uber. And a very close classmate of mine from the MBA was working at a Series A fintech. And he said, this is amazing. You need to come here. This is going to be great. And I was like, oh, great. This will work out just the way Uber did. And so I jumped ship. I changed function to cover people and also investor relations and fundraising. It became clear to me fairly quickly that it was not the match that I thought it was. I left somewhat more slowly after that, ultimately stayed about 6 or 8 months. And then was like, okay, I'm going to take a sabbatical, which is what you can brand it now when you decide to just do nothing. And really did that, like really did nothing, like watered my plants, traveled a bit for a couple of months. And that was kind of when the consulting journey started.
That makes a lot of sense. And then in terms of consulting, you mentioned you talked, to Max. There was a couple of people who already did it in the past. I'm just curious to hear, what was the aha moment that kind of made you take the leap into consulting? And how you found out about it, like at all, right? Was it through Max? Was through something else? I'm just curious.
Yeah, actually, my aha moment came recently, even though I have been doing this since about August of last year. My first client came through accidentally, actually through Max, but then we didn't talk about it again for like 9 months. But it landed in my lap through him. I did a project that was fairly people related. He had a contact at a startup that was looking to do an offsite in Mexico City. And he was like, I think you can help them. And it had never occurred to me that I could do this because yes, while I was at Uber, I organized an offsite for the leadership team like every 6 months and for other teams. And so I was like, yes, I can definitely do this, but it never occurred to me that it was something I could sell to other people. And then, so I did that and sort of thought of it as a one-off. And at the same time, I was looking for what I thought would be my next full-time role. And I did a program that my MBA had for folks that were, I think it was called like Finding Your Next Career Move. And so they put us through a set of exercises where we laid out like what were our values and how did they match to our previous roles and what are our priorities now and what are we looking for, and you would develop a set of hypotheses about what you thought you wanted to do, and then you would go and test them. And none of my hypotheses were consulting, by the way, spoiler alert. But the way you test them is by taking on consulting projects or by taking on short-term projects to see like, okay, I have a hypothesis that I might be interested in this function or I might be interested in this type of company. Let me test that by doing a short-term project. And so I kind of was like, okay, well, I've got this side gig, which is the consulting thing, while I figure out what I want to do with my life. And I was not finding anything full-time that I was really excited about. And then in the meantime, my kind of side gig became, in terms of time commitment and in terms of revenue, like an actual job. And eventually I was like, admitted to myself, okay, this is my job now. Like, this is what I'm drawn to. This is what I'm excited about. This is what I want to spend time on. And that was kind of recently that I was like, okay, this is my job. And so then I put a brand on it, and said, okay, well, I have been doing this, but why don't I actually tell people this is what I'm doing rather than like quietly in my office at home working with clients, like tell people this is what I'm doing and making this my next steps.
That makes a lot of sense. And also just based on your career, you've had, very broad range of experiences. I'm just curious to hear like what was that experimentation like in the beginning on defining, I guess, like your offering? Because it sounds like you started with an offsite. Maybe I saw your description now, you're doing a little bit of fundraising. So how did that evolve over time? And was there a framework you used to just kind of to experiment with these kind of offerings? How did you kind of go with that process?
Yeah, so I've definitely pivoted, I guess you can say, from my first project. And that was actually a function of the way I was going about finding clients. When I had first graduated from the MBA, but before I started working, I had joined a platform called Cultivo that at the time was focused on freelancing for finance professionals, and they have like a screening process. And so I had done some gigs with them, in 2017, but the platform was still there. And so I was like, oh, okay, great. I can go back to this and see kind of what they have. And they had categorized me as finance. And so I'm still categorized for them as finance. And so I found through them, and it was one of the hypotheses I was testing was like, do I want to go more in a finance direction, having been in kind of strategy and people and other functions? And so I ended up finding a lot of startups that thought they needed fundraising. Once I start working with them, we often find that they actually need other things. They think they need a financial model. What they actually need is a pitch deck. What they think they need is venture capital funding. And what they actually should be doing is bootstrapping. So I end up working with them, I guess, kind of as a chief of staff, helping them think through strategic problems, helping them with fundraising. But that has been, in terms of finding folks, what they feel like they have an urgent need, which is fundraising. And that's kind of how the conversation starts.
Makes a lot of sense. And I would say like a lot of the times when I speak to like first-time consultants or consultants who are a little bit further along the journey, they always like sort of say almost like 80 to 100% of my clients come through network. You mentioned marketplaces, right? So I'm curious to go a little bit deeper on that, right? Like what's been your experience with these kind of marketplaces? Do you have any tips for some of the ones other members at Landa should look at? How do you win clients there? I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that tactic as well.
Yeah. If I were to do it again, I wouldn't necessarily say like this is the way to do it. Clearly I've gotten to where I've gotten because it's worked for me. I haven't had the same level of success with all platforms. I tried some of the ones that are more kind of open to everyone. And I found that it's very difficult to compete there because there is like a high volume of folks that are on these platforms that are competing on price. And that's not really the space that I play in. There's another set of platforms where you have to apply to get in, and there is screening on both the client side and on the talent side. I've joined a number of those, and for whatever reason, like the skill set project match has worked well for me on TopTel, and I haven't gotten traction on other platforms. But I've got to imagine that there are folks where they're finding, just based on their specific skill set, that it works better in other places. The benefit, I'll say, of being on these platforms is that you see where there's demand, like what kind of things are folks looking for. So when you're thinking about what can I offer, and actually a lot of the folks that were in this Stanford Figure Out What You Want to Do with Your Life program were like 10, 15 years further ahead of me in their career, trying to figure out what they wanted to do with their lives. And were also like, oh, maybe I will try consulting as a potential option. And they too were trying to figure out, what do I offer? And so I was like, okay, no one has this figured out. So you kind of need to find like, where is an intersection of like what there's demand for in the market, what can be done on a consulting basis, and what do I know how to do? And so the benefit of being on these platforms is it helps you identify what there is demand for in the market. You know what you can do, and you know what you can do on a consulting basis. And the other benefit of being on the platforms is just volume. I've gotten a lot better at selling the more I've done it, and I've gotten a high volume of potential clients through these platforms. So when I first started, if I got to the point where I was speaking with a client, I would close like 1 in 3, 1 in 5. And now my closing rate is like 45% if I get in front of someone. So obviously there's been a learning curve there of just doing it over and over again. You get better at finding how you can deliver value for clients. And the ones that I don't close is because we don't, like, there's not actually a fit there.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And then in terms of your process, right? It sounds like you're relying a lot on this platform. It's worked out super well for you. Is there a set, process or system that you're using to just consistently be generating new leads or talking to these people? I'm just curious to hear like how has your process evolved as well, or how does it look like now as well?
Yeah, so with the platforms, I think what's helpful is having a very clear written pitch and then a set of kind of work samples that demonstrate what you can do. So my process there is like now pretty efficient. I would say I figured out kind of like what works with different types of offerings that I can provide. And then I refine my materials because I've now had a number of clients. And so I can kind of pick from the best ones and say like, this I think will resonate with a number of different potential clients. Now that I have finally, the first step is admitting that you're a consultant. Now that I finally admitted to myself that I'm a consultant, I am looking outside of the platforms, absolutely, in terms of leveraging my network and starting conversations with folks. And so that's kind of how this is evolving for me. The limitation of being on a platform is you don't own your client. And so in terms of using your clients to generate new clients, or kind of being able to own that relationship, being able to negotiate more different types of contracts, it's really limiting. So it's great, and it was super helpful for me to get started, but it's not necessarily going to offer everything you need if you want to do this on a full-time basis.
Makes sense. And then you mentioned a lot of times like full-time basis. You obviously like you drafted a name. Is that entity already set up? And I'm just curious to hear like if it is, what are some of the benefits you've seen in actually like having a business entity separate to your just individual entity and income?
Yeah. So from an accounting perspective, it's an individual proprietorship. So I don't have like an LLC or anything like that. For context, I'm an American citizen, so I pay taxes no matter where I am. I'm based in Mexico City. So there's one thing that's kind of like the legal and tax entities. And then there's the other thing that I would say is more conceptual, which is if you make a website, say, which is a fairly easy thing to do, you have to actually put down in writing what it is that you offer, and forcing yourself to go through that exercise. Or make a pitch deck, for example. If you have a client that's come through your network and they're like, can you put together a proposal for me? You have to articulate what it is that you do, why they need to hire you, like how are you going to add value. So I'd say more than creating a separate, credit card account and bank account for your business, which you should do, or my accountant tells me I should do. It's about psychologically and kind of mentally defining what it is that you offer and how you add value, and writing it down is somehow different than saying it.
I completely agree. Amazing. And then just to transition to another topic, because I know you had a chat with Pedro, really good chat this morning, and he mentioned you had some consulting gigs with other folks, with other consultants. How is that dynamic, right? Like I'm curious to hear more about what was it to work with other consultants? Are you open to it, generally speaking, and do you see a path for you to outsource some of your work as well in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, in my very first gig, I brought someone else in to help me out on all the logistics of everything, and I think that worked well. And then I've also had the reverse, where I've been subcontracted by 2 different times, folks that are maybe 10, 15 years further along in their careers, that are doing consulting and are looking for someone who has specific niche. In this case, they both found me through the platform. They were looking for someone that had like an investing niche, that understood. They were more kind of like management consulting backgrounds, and so they wanted someone with like that finance piece to kind of complete what it is they're offering with their clients. So on the one hand, you're kind of like, oh, I've gone and become an independent contractor, so I can be my own boss, and now I'm like I'm being subcontracted by this other contractor. But actually, I learn a lot from seeing how they manage their clients, seeing how they manage their projects, from the feedback that they give me. So it's actually, so far for me, been a really good learning experience, working with these other folks.
Amazing. I completely agree. Like I always rely on best practices from like other folks who are a little bit more experienced than me. And then just transitioning to the second part of the question, I'm curious to hear, how this practice evolves for you in the future. How does Chrissy see herself and her consulting company looking like maybe in the next 5 years? Do you see a world in which like you also outsource? How would you go about it? I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially certain parts of what I do that are more like corporate strategy. I think those are things that you can really productize. And that's something that you can kind of outsource. Something like coaching a founder one-on-one, that's a lot harder to outsource. So there are pieces kind of that you'll never step away from. And then there are pieces that you can essentially turn into a service because you've offered it so many times and it's standardized. Something like building a financial model or creating a pitch deck, or creating a hiring process, or a piece that's going to be a bit more standardized. I could definitely see that. The other thing, and I've seen this actually in my first conversations when I was getting started, I reached out to a woman who graduated the MBA at the same time as me. She started her own business doing culture consulting, originally focused on clients in the US military, and then has since kind of grown it. And she had kind of an informal network of folks that she worked with and would bring in on certain projects. They would bring her in on certain projects. And I think as I look at my business now, other people that are in my network that are doing a similar thing, but with different expertise, could actually make a lot of sense, because I work with startup clients that often don't have their first hires and don't necessarily have the funding, or they're not quite ready to take the plunge with a full-time hire. And they'll ask me like, hey, do you know anyone who could be a partner and CMO? Do you know anyone who could do this? And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for folks that are doing this to stay in touch with each other, and potentially cross-sell.
Makes total sense. Amazing. And then one more that I had is just because of your description as well. Seems like you've worked with clients from Brisbane to SF, et cetera. Like, how's that process been, right? Because working with somebody who's like maybe like a 14-hour difference is always a little bit challenge. There's a little bit of imposter syndrome, extra imposter syndrome there. I'm just curious to hear like how was that process and just kind of like mentally adjusting to like take those cutting clients, and then how is the process like live, right? Just managing with the
Yeah.
culture differences, time zone, etc.
Yeah. That's actually something I really love about this job. Like what I like the most is getting to work with founders and executives and like getting to know the different people, and they're also different. So it's like keeps you really entertained. The Brisbane one was actually my first TopTal client when I restarted TopTal in 2022. I had crazy imposter syndrome with him because this was kind of my first time going back to doing consulting after a while. He is also a first-time founder, and so he had a bit of imposter syndrome. So like he put his bio, and his bio was like very understated. I was like, you need to brag about yourself more. And at the same time in my head, I'm like, okay, I need to take my own advice. In terms of timing, oof, that was tough. We would do, fortunately, he had kids and was an early riser. And so he would do his mornings before, because he was doing some kind of full-time work that was like sort of 9 to 5. So he would come into the office an hour early and we would do our calls. And then a lot of the actual work, which is not meetings, is asynchronous. So that was fine. I had a Austrian client that had a project in South Africa. So he was like very Austrian. And then the project was like mining. And he wanted like specifically down to the minute, how long is it going to take me to do different things? And then obviously working with like US clients, Canadian clients, it's totally different mindset. They're like working until midnight. Sundays doesn't matter, like very different working culture. But it kind of is, for me, it's what keeps me interested, is working with all the different founders and who all have kind of different backgrounds.
No, it makes sense. And also, as you're a little bit further along, like there's been success, and that usually turns off imposter syndrome or just reduces it a lot more. I'm just curious to hear, like, if you were to give tips on how to handle imposter syndrome for first time consultants, like what would you say, I guess, like to Chrissy in her first gig or looking for his first gig?
Yeah. It never totally goes away, but you learn how to manage it better. And you have like more data points where you can say like, okay, I actually do know what I'm doing. I think what has been helpful for me, and I probably should have started doing earlier, is really reading a lot in whatever the topic is that I'm consulting on, and feeling like I can have expertise in something because I can point to specific sources that are telling me XYZ thing, or being tuned into, for example, in fundraising, like what are the trends in like what are Series A valuations looking like these days, or what are seed round valuations looking like these days, and really having more of that kind of market intel in the area where you're consulting. Doesn't make you better or worse at doing your job, but it will make you feel potentially more confident that you have expertise that you can share.
Completely agree. So I'm actually out of questions from my side, but thanks a lot, Chrissy. I'm curious to hear, like, if someone were to like try to look for you, where can they find you? Where can they find your offering as well, in case they run into an interesting project that fits your scope? I'm just curious. Is there a website for Cultivo?
Yes, I have a website. I'll put it in the chat here. It's cultivo.me. And a plug for my services. So thank you for the space to advertise.
Of course.
I am effectively a part-time chief of staff. I help founders with challenges in corporate strategy. So that can be org, that can be hiring, that can be firing, that can be talent, that can be executives, strategy, like figuring out what your business model should look like, how should your pricing look, so like sort of traditional strategy. And then always every startup needs fundraising. And so work with my clients a lot on that. And then just coaching, helping you think through problems and solve them yourself without giving you the answers. You can find me at cultivo.me. I'm Chrissy at cultivo.me. I'll put it in the chat. Even if you don't have a project, I love having these conversations. I'm super grateful for the people that have them with me at various points through my career. So I'm very happy to pay it forward. Feel free to reach out to me just to say hi, ask me questions. And I'll put
that's amazing
info in the chat.
No, thanks for that. I know a lot of future consultants are going to reach out to you for sure. Thanks for the space. Cool. So that was kind of my part. I'm happy to just open it up for the audience as well. I saw there were no questions in the chat. Yes, confirming no questions in the chat. But we can just do it like that. Unmute yourself if you want to ask something to Chrissy. It's your space now.
Hey, Chrissy, this is Manuel, and I'm sorry if you answered this question. I had to let the dog out quickly, but I was just wondering, did you go through one of the cohorts for Landa or?
No, I reconnected with Chuko when I had a conversation with a mutual colleague of ours from Uber, who is in the early stages of considering starting a consulting career after doing Uber and then a few startups. And he was like, "Oh, this was like a podcast." And I was like, "Okay, I don't think I'm a podcast." But then literally the next week, serendipity, Chuko posted about this, and he tagged me in it. And I'm kind of recently talking about this and really being part of the community. So it's not something, as I mentioned in my talk, that I was really kind of active with before. But it basically formalizes what I think a lot of us are doing informally, which is sharing best practices with other people that are doing similar things, finding community in a role that can sometimes feel very much like an individual role, because you're not necessarily working with a team the way you might have been. And like sharing, pretty much everyone that I've talked to who's doing something similar to this has talked about imposter syndrome. So there's like the hard skills of, okay, what should I put in the contract, or how should I do pricing? And then the kind of softer skills of, how do I go through those moments when I have no new clients coming in and some clients rolling off, and I don't know if this is going to go away, if this is ever going to last, kind of going through those moments together. I think it's really cool what Chuko and Pedro are doing.
Awesome. Thank you.
I actually have another question, Christine. Just to sort of round up the conversation, did you have some bad experiences at all? And some things you would do differently, or like you wouldn't work with a certain type of client, some red flags to look for? That'd be interesting.
Yeah. There is one type of client that has become a red flag for me because I got hired by one. And so I think you have to kind of balance, there's a piece about imposter syndrome of, I don't know how to do this. And so there's the stuff you know how to do, and then there's stuff that's kind of adjacent to that. You're like, I think I can do this. And then there's stuff that's probably you can't do or doesn't make sense for you to do. And one of those things that I found that's kind of over that line is when a client says they're looking for a business plan. That for me, I had an experience with a client who said they were looking for a business plan. This client was a BBC anchor that was looking to create her own media company, and she wanted a business plan for what this would look like. I don't have deep experience in media. She wanted the business plan because she was talking to potential investors. And so I was like, okay, what she really needs is a pitch deck. And so I started working on that for her. But because she didn't really know what her business model was, the pitch deck obviously wasn't coming together. And so like quite quickly they were like, yeah, we're going to put this on pause and we'll get back to you, which is a very polite way of saying like, we will never speak to you again. But so that was my learning, was if the founder, the entrepreneur, isn't clear on what their business is, you can't invent that for them. Like they need to have a clear vision. You can't create that for them. You can help them figure out how to execute on that vision. But like there's some cases that kind of, if they don't have that maybe it doesn't make sense for you to get involved. So that one, when I see they want a business plan, now I'm like, let's talk to them and see what they really need before saying yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, it makes all the sense in the world. you can't build their company for them.
Exactly, yeah.
Chrissy, I have a question for you. I'm Abigail. I also was another U.S. citizen to another who has relocated to Mexico more recently than you, but I've been in the fractional world now for a few years and decided to go fully fractional a little over a year ago. I'm curious to know, have you worked with clients in Latin America? Has that been an easy transition? Has that been difficult? Just asking because I had sort of assumed, since all of my clients have been US based, that I wouldn't add necessarily as much value for Latin American early stage startups, but I'm just curious what your findings have been navigating between the startup community in both markets.
Yeah. Since up until recently, most of my clients were coming through the platform. It was just kind of wherever they came from. And then also there was kind of like, is there a match between the client's budget and what I charge? And so maybe that didn't work as well for some of these things that are on the platform, because then you're paying, like they are obviously taking a fee on top of that. So far I haven't had any Latin American clients, which I was previously at a Mexican fintech startup that was completely Mexican and like only in Latin America. And it was like a very LatAm focused job. And then I switched to being completely non-LatAm focused. I did, right when I left that company, have a lot of conversations with people that were looking to hire full-time for roles. And I knew I wasn't going to do something full-time. I thought I wanted to do nothing, but I was entertaining the idea of something part-time. And I had, at that time, a couple of people who said, we'd love to hire you part-time, and we'll figure out how this is going to work. We can do it on a contract basis. I, at that point, wasn't ready to jump into that. And so I didn't take them up on moving forward with that. But I do think they were all Latin American startups. I do think that there is opportunity there. It's just not something that I've pursued to date. But without even looking for it, I had kind of inbound.
Hey, Chrissy, this is Manuel again. I was just wondering, have you hired employees, and where have you hired them, like geographically, and what have you used to hire them, if you have hired them? Like what platform or?
Yeah. The one time I hired someone, it was someone in my own network that I had previously worked with. At this point, if I were to bring someone into a project again, I think it would also again be someone through my own network that I personally know, that I can vouch for their work product. Because what I'm really selling to my clients is I'm someone you can trust. And if I am going to recommend something to you, I want to feel pretty good about how that person is going to deliver. Clearly, you eventually reach a point where you need expertise that you don't have direct access to, and that's how these people are finding me. And so I can imagine as this grows over time, I'll get to the point where, and okay, this is a great example. Someone says, I need a fractional CMO, one of my clients, and they said, do you know anyone? And I know a lot of fractional people, but I didn't actually know someone that was exactly right for this role. I don't think they're ready, the client, to go down this path just yet. But when I do get to that point, I'll have to think about like, okay, how would I help them source this person? Because they haven't really even made their first hire yet.
Thank you.
Hey Chris, how are you? Thibault here. I had a question for you actually. Did you maybe find a pattern in the segments of startups that made sense for you, for what you're doing in terms maybe of growth stage, of maturity stage, that is really like niche that makes sense? And also that can have the budget to allocate to that kind of resources?
Yeah. It depends, I would say, on kind of like how they're finding me and what they're looking for and which of my offerings they're interested in. The ones that are looking for help, or the ones that think they're looking for fundraising are usually first-time founders, and they're usually pre-Series A. And they're looking for someone that can help them kind of navigate this whole world. And then ultimately what they actually kind of need is maybe something else. So that's sort of one group. And then I would say folks that are looking for more like general, sort of more on the internal, helping them think through hiring, helping them think through culture, helping them think through strategy. That tends to be a bit later stage where they have kind of more built out. And they need help thinking through kind of specific problems, or they're CEOs that just need someone to take stuff off their plate. And they've gotten to the point where they can't do everything. They can't hire specifically for every single function that they are covering, and they need that kind of in between.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Chris.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but just to answer the second half of that question, the pre-Series A, obviously, especially pre-seed, they are going to be a lot more budget sensitive because they don't have as much money to spend. But that can start as like a once every 2 weeks mentoring session, and will grow into something over time, kind of as the company matures.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's exactly like a case I had last week, and I want to understand what's the best way to approach that kind of coaching, and what's the frequency to educate also on what's the value that you can add on the short term and the midterm. So yeah, very interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Hi, Chrissy. Miguel here. Have you ever had a customer that has been related to any vertical, a specific vertical or business in which you've been related, and probably had sensitive or important information that probably you didn't feel confident on sharing or using it for your projects? And if yes, how did you do it?
Like a potential kind of competitor to someplace that I previously worked.
Exactly.
Yes, actually, yes, I do actually have one that is a very early stage startup that is a potential competitor to Uber Eats. But they are so small and early stage that it doesn't feel like a direct competitor, right? They're focused on something that would be an innovation for Uber that Uber's not focused on right now. So like if Uber had decided that they want to focus on this space and go into, actually there's two. And both of them are things that would be like ancillary businesses for Uber, but Uber is like kind of in that space. And one of them I actually brought up to George Gordon, who was the head of the region. And I was like, what do you think about this? And he was like, oh, that's cool. Let me know if you want me to introduce you to anyone. Like, I don't think, because the stages are so different, I don't think there's like a conflict of interest there. I think what would be challenging would be like consulting for Rappi after working at Uber, for example, right? Like that's like kind of a more direct competitor. That is not a situation I've found myself in. But when it's someone who's like If you've read Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma, it talks about disruptive technologies and how there are these like small companies that are focused on areas that are outside of the core business of the incumbent. And by definition, the incumbents don't focus on these things because they're focused on their core business, and then they end up getting disrupted. So like Kodak and digital cameras is the kind of classic example. And so like if you're working in 1980 whatever, or 90 whatever, I don't know when digital cameras came out, 90 whatever, on digital cameras and a startup that has like 13 people, and you previously worked at Kodak, you don't really feel like, oh, I'm going to one day disrupt Kodak, because that's like 10 years from now when that actually happens.
Thank you.
Cool. Any last takers? I'll take this as a no. So we can cut off here, Chrissy. It was great seeing you again. Thanks a lot. A lot of gems that I took from this conversation. We're going to share your contact information. So thanks again for sharing that and being open to help out future consultants. I think giving back is definitely the way to go here. But yeah, thanks a lot. Let's close here, and thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Juco. Thanks for the space.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Thanks, Chrissy.
Thanks, Chrissy.
Have a great night, guys.
You too. Bye-bye.